This week I posted a short about the biggest real tank battle. This short was by far the one that sparked the most discussion because a lot of people who watched it, and by the way, if you don't know that I'm posting daily shorts with war trivia, you should start watching. Go to the Shorts tab on the Sala de Guerra channel page. I'm sure you'll like it, okay? Watch it later. Then come back here and tell me if you liked it or not. But I put it there, right? The actual greatest tank battle of all time, just to be clear. Why? Because most people have this understanding that the Battle of Kursk in July 1943 is the biggest tank battle in history, right? Why? Because that's how it's portrayed in the most important books, the books we read when we were kids, right? The documentaries from the 90s, all of them say that the Battle of Kursk is the biggest tank battle in history, right? And the Battle of Kursk, man, when we talk about the Eastern Front, it's super famous, right? Only Stalingrad gets mentioned more, that's it. The rest is Kursk. So, we're actually talking about an operation, right? That's what the Germans called it, right? Operation Citadel, Unternehmen Citadel, which took place, which happened in a huge area, okay? I don't even like to call it the Battle of Kursk, because if you're going to call that a battle, it's much more realistic to call it the Battle of the Kursk Salient. Because Kursk was never a battlefield, not at that time, okay? The city of Kursk, it never actually became a battlefield. It never became a battlefield. Because the German fronts never got close to Kursk. Far from it, man. So the estimates we have, these are the so-called classic estimates from the Cold War era, pointed to a total of 6,000 tanks, right? 6,000 tanks, counting both German and Soviet vehicles fighting there in the Kursk area, okay? From Operation Citadel. So before we continue, we first need to try to clarify a little bit what the concept of a battle is, right? And this concept, even though for those who already know it might seem very black and white, might seem very straightforward, it's actually very fluid. And battle, if you look it up in a dictionary, you'll see that it's a confrontation between two enemy forces, right? Two opposing forces in a defined area, and that this confrontation leads to a result. But the Battle of Kursk itself is a collection of other battles, isn't it? The most famous of them, the Battle of Prokhorovka. That's right, that's a small village near the southern front, where there was a huge battle between German and Soviet armored vehicles. And it happened in one day, right? In a single day. Isn't that more or less how we usually understand battles? The Battle of Jutland, the English fleet against the German fleet, North Sea. Result? Done. Battle of El Alamein, British force against German force. Western Egypt, such and such day to such and such day. Result? X. So it seems like the concept of battle is clear, but look, the Battle of the Atlantic, man. Battle of the Atlantic. It happened from 1939 to 1945, involving how many submarines and surface ships from both sides in engagements that took place from the Arctic all the way down to the south of Argentina? Incredible, right? How come a scenario like this isn't academically known as the Atlantic Campaign, just like the Battle of the Atlantic? There wasn't non-stop fighting there every single day. These were forces that would meet sporadically to fight, you know? So the concept of a battle is a bit too fluid, which makes it kind of hard for us to be definitive. But do you know how I'm going to try to settle this with you today? I'm going to try to show you that the largest number of opposing tanks, meaning enemy tanks, gathered in a single space, fighting a single enemy. It was at the Battle of Brody in June 1941, and not at the famous Battle of Kursk in July 1943. So, more than 2 years before Kursk, the largest tank battle in history did happen, okay? So we're also talking about a traditional number, and I mentioned that, didn't I? I said that there are classic estimates and new estimates, right? Why? Because during the Cold War, with the Soviet archives still under the exclusive control of the Kremlin, the estimates depended on what the Kremlin did or didn't approve. So, for example, you had estimates in Prokhorovka of thousands of vehicles, and the most conservative one said 1,500 vehicles were involved in Prokhorovka, right? When the then Russian historian Valery Zamulin accessed archives in 2011, they told him that it didn't even reach 1,000 or so. There were 978 vehicles in total, with 206 of them being German and 672 Russian. So it doesn't even reach 1,000 vehicles in Prokhorovka. So what do I want to highlight with these numbers from Prokhorovka? Why? Because take a look at this map you're looking at right now, which is the map of the Battle of Kursk. Check out this Battle of Kursk map. You notice that there's a northern German pincer and a southern German pincer, right? They never met, never came together. They were nowhere near meeting. Look at Kursk right there in the middle, man. Kursk is really far from the actual front line, right? And how did the defensive and offensive setup of this operation play out? Let's start with the defenders first. The Soviets, look here. You had 5X up here, an army group. The Soviet equivalent of an army group is the front, okay? The Voronezh front under General Nikolai Vatutin was the one responsible for defending the southern part of the Kursk salient. Meanwhile, Marshal Konstantin Rokossovsky's Central Front was assigned to defend the north of the salient. And on the German side, you also had an army group center led by General Günther von Kluge, who was fighting in the north and aimed to form the northern pincer against the salient. And in the south, the Army Group South, led by Erich von Manstein. So, on both the Soviet and German sides, you had independent formations and commands for the north and south of the Kursk line. So, even though we call it the Battle of Kursk, up to this point, we're actually talking about two distinct simultaneous operations. Okay, but they were distinct with different logistics, different air support, and even different artillery support. Maybe in an alternate scenario they would have met, but that wasn't the case. So the battles we saw, mainly at Prokhorovka, here in the south, okay, against Paul Hauser's 2nd SS Panzer Corps here, against the 5th Guards Tank Army, okay, which entered combat in the Prokhorovka area. As you saw, the new estimates mention around 978 vehicles in total. So keep this image of Kursk in mind so we can understand that the two groups of armored vehicles, right, 6,000 in total according to the most traditional estimates, about 3,000 on one side and 3,000 on the other. Okay, so these 6,000 vehicles were never fighting together in the same space, right? The largest concentration was 1,000 vehicles, right? So now we have to analyze what happened in the Battle of Brody. And the Battle of Brody, it has reasons for which it is so little known. And you probably didn't know about the Battle of Brody until today, right? First, the Battle of Brody is the opposite of Kursk, which was a tremendous triumph for the Red Army. It's a tremendous disaster for the Red Army, okay? And it also happens during a period of complete chaos, almost anarchy, on the Soviet front line. Because it's contained within those first 10 days, right? The famous first 10 days of Operation Barbarossa, in which Stalin disappears, right? Stalin. He can't be found anywhere. Okay? So this moment is a bit embarrassing, a bit too shameful for the Red Army, which was caught without a defensive plan. In those advanced positions, right, with very dense troop concentrations close to the German border. And when this battle happened, the Soviet response was completely ineffective. Okay? In this battle, which took place between June 23 and 27, 1941, so we're talking about the very first week of Barbarossa, no less than 750 German tanks faced 3,500 Soviet tanks. And who is it that gives a lot of weight to Brody's claim as the biggest tank battle in history rather than Kursk? The one who gives that claim real weight is simply the Pope of the Eastern Front, the Pope of Eastern Front historiography, none other than Colonel David Glantz. If you don't know who David Glantz is and you like military history, you should go to the nearest encyclopedia right now and look him up. Look up his entry. You need to know this guy and his work are essential. David Glantz is a United States Army officer, an intellectual, prolific, fluent in Russian, and a researcher of historiography. When the Soviet Union began to collapse at the end of the 1980s and finally fell in 1991, he was one of the very few people on our planet Earth to have access to the Soviet archives in Moscow. And David Glantz, of course, went straight to the World War II archives. He went straight to the archives that dealt with Soviet operations between 1941 and 1945. And the guy then had access to data that are official records, many of which contradict that traditional Soviet Cold War narrative. So his literature is incredible, nothing less than incredible. First of all, it's in English. Unfortunately, for those who don't speak or understand English, this can be a bit of a problem, right? I'm not sure if any of Glantz's books are translated into Portuguese. If so, maybe just one or two. I don't know, but the vast majority of the dozens of books he's authored are in English, right? So, man, David Glantz clearly says that Brody is bigger than Kursk. It's bigger than Prokhorov. Precisely because Glantz is a technical guy. He's a technical academic. He understands what a tank battle is, and that this force is in the same space fighting the same enemy, right? So when these factors come into the equation, it becomes clear that Brody is much bigger than any engagement that took place in the Kursk salient area in 1943, right? As I told you, there's this whole issue of the tanks being very close to the border. And there's also the issue of the border battles being an embarrassment for the Soviet Union. And there's also the factor that cements Kursk's status, because it's a romantic factor, since in Kursk you have the main characters, the famous tanks, the tanks that everyone loves. There's the Tiger, the Panther, the Elephant, and on the Soviet side, you have the Su-100, the Su-85, which is also there, and the T-34S are there in large numbers, right? So in Kursk, you almost have a cinematic product. Wow, what did Brody feature? It featured thousands of T-26 tanks, light tanks from the early 1930s, which had even fought in the Spanish Civil War. The Germans were already familiar with the fragility of this vehicle. Also, several thousand BT-7S, the most updated version of the BT tanks, which were high-speed light tanks. They could even operate without tracks, right? They were designed to have both track and wheel drive. And man, only a fraction of those tanks involved at Brody, of those 3,500 tanks committed at Brody, were actually new tanks, right? The KVs, right? KV-1 and KV-2, and the T-34S, the very first T-34S. So we're talking about 700 tanks here. Heavy tanks, medium and heavy tanks, T-34S and KVs, right? Out of those 750, maybe you have 250 T-34s. So that's just a few vehicles compared to the total involved in the battle, right? And where did this battle take place? This battle happened just beyond the Soviet border. That was the starting point of Army Group South. It was the starting point of Gerd von Rundstedt's Army Group South. So Marshal Rundstedt's initial objective was to conquer Ukraine. His secondary objective was to enter the Caucasus, but that was never realistic for 1941. So, to conquer Ukraine. So that meant conquering Kiev first, and Kiev is in the center of Ukrainian territory. And to that end, Kiev was a strategic objective with tactical objectives beyond it. The first tactical objective is to cut the Lviv-Kiev railway. So for that, the 1st Panzer Group of the Wehrmacht. This Panzer Group had been created in 1940 under the command of General Ewald von Kleist, who was the first commander of a Panzer Group, right? And the Panzer Group, it's an aggregation of 2 or more Army Corps, right? They can be Panzer Corps or motorized corps. So, in the end, towards the end of 1941, the Panzer Corps received the designation Panzer Army. Here it's easier to understand, right, the Panzer Army than a Panzer Group. But just so you know what things were actually like, in June 1941, it was Panzer Group 1 under Ewald von Kleist. So in this Panzer Group, there were 3 Army Corps gathered there, 3 German motorized corps, the 3rd, the 14th, and the 48th Corps. Within those corps, there were 5 Panzer divisions, and another 4 motorized divisions, 2 of which were from the Waffen SS. A total of 800 tanks, 800 German tanks. About half of them were, about half, Panzer III and Panzer IV. The other half, Panzer I, Panzer II, and the Czech Panzer 38T. Okay, so you had only half of that force that really had combat value, right, man? Which were mainly the Panzer III and Panzer IV.
Homage.
Who was in front of Army Group South? Who was facing them? It was the Southwestern Front, or Southwestern Front, commanded by General Mikhail Kirponos. Okay, so Mikhail Kirponos. Kirponos had commanded a significant troop unit in the Winter War against Finland. So in 1939-40, he achieved good results in the final phase of the conflict and therefore was awarded the Gold Star of Hero of the Soviet Union as early as 1940. Therefore, he already had a solid reputation within the weakened Red Army of that time, right? We say weakened because all the changes that were implemented very hastily by the high command in Moscow, right? By the high command of the Army General Staff, led by Georgy Zhukov, there in Moscow, after the fall of France in 1940, were still being implemented, right? And the Red Army had suffered a large number of gaps because of the purges of the late 1930s. Therefore, Mikhail Karapanos was quite an impressive figure, right? A very renowned figure at that time. The front he commanded was a very important one. He had, therefore, under his command, no less than 6 mechanized corps. 6. 4th, 8th, and 9th Mechanized Corps, 15th, 19th, and 22nd Mechanized Corps. Now tell me, how many tanks did Karapanos command? Just him. You don't know, do you? 5,000 tanks. 5 tanks. Tanks. Man, 5,000 tanks out of a force of more than 20,000. A conservative estimate that the Red Army had at that time. Karapanos alone, man, had more tanks than the whole Wehrmacht. And then, can you imagine that? Just him. So, but do you know what the problem is? Most of Karapanos' tanks were light tanks, right? They were BT-7 and T-26 tanks, like I said. And the German invasion caught everyone by surprise. Really, everyone. So these formations weren't even in the same place. They weren't even positioned to be able to react to an enemy attack, right? Why? Because the Battle of Brody starts the very next day after the invasion began. The invasion starts on the 22nd, and the Battle of Brody will start on the 23rd. And where is it really going to start? You can see on the map there that we can draw a kind of triangle, man. You can draw a kind of triangle between the cities of Lutsk, Brody, and Dubno, right? Lutsk, Brody, and Dubno. And after the German army captured Lviv, right? Yeah. That whole area would be swept. That whole border area would be overrun. So when Kleist entered this area with the 1st Panzer Army, what did he find? He started to encounter Soviet armored formations in very large numbers. But was it a single formation? Was it a single armored front? It was not a single armored front. And I'll explain to you why, okay? What's going to happen? By the 2nd day of the war, the Luftwaffe had already wiped out the Soviet Air Force from the sky. So there was nothing else the Russians could launch to be able to do proper reconnaissance, to be able to attack the German vanguards or bomb the German rear lines. Nothing. So the ones actually being attacked were the Soviet rear lines by the Stukas, the Heinkels, the Dorniers, and the Junkers. Ju-88, right? So more than this chaos on the front line and in the rear caused by enemy air supremacy, you had a lack of clear orders. Why? Because Stalin disappeared. Where's Stalin, man? He vanished. So in Stalin's absence, the one who really took the reins was Georgy Zhukov himself. And what did Zhukov do? Zhukov, since it was really impossible to communicate effectively with the front line, he flew. He took a plane from Moscow and went to the front line himself to take control of the situation there. He himself from there, together with the commanders. And then, when he got there, he realized that the logistics at the front line were completely broken. Why? Because the logistics from Karapanos' command to his front line units depended on, this communication, was done through telegraph lines and civilian telephone lines, right? traditional telephone lines. And then both the Germans and Ukrainian guerrillas had already taken that down, had already cut that. They had already compromised the Soviet ability to communicate, right? So what happens next? What happens is that Zhukov starts ordering Kirpanis to launch attacks immediately. But Kirpanis, he's still gathering his troops. His infantry and artillery troops are still far from the battlefield. The battlefield is blocked by the Luftwaffe, and the ones who can get there faster are the tanks, of course, the motorized ones, right? But the tanks alone being committed against the German front line, which is a textbook example of combined arms warfare, right? Of infantry, artillery, aviation, and tanks. So what's going to happen, man, in the 4 days between the 23rd and the 27th? Within those 4 days, the vast majority of those BT-7s and those T-26s will be obliterated by anti-tank weapons. German ones, okay? Remember that those BT-7S and those T-26 offer almost no protection. They don't have enough armor to withstand even a 37mm gun, let alone the 50, the 75, and especially the 88, right? The famous 88. When the first KV-1S and the first T-34S arrive, that's when the Germans get a shock. But there are so few of them, and they're being committed to the fight in such an irresponsible, so confused way that they can't really make a difference, right? The tanks run out of fuel, and the unit commander, the platoon or tank company commander, literally has to go there with a hose, suck out the remaining fuel from one, put it in a canister, and pour it into another tank. In other words, if you have a little bit of gas in 10 tanks, you fill up 2 tanks, right? You fill up the fuel tank of 2 armored vehicles and send 2 armored vehicles into battle. It's chaos. It's never-ending chaos. So the Germans, they keep clearing the way. In this situation, the only parallel I can draw for you, just to make it simple for you to understand, Brody is very similar to that movie Mad Max, Fury Road. Have you seen Mad Max, Fury Road? There's the protagonist's truck that's constantly attacked by the enemy's vehicles, but it's always one by one attacking, right? One attacks, then another, then another. The guys in the truck win, and everyone leaves. So that's pretty much it. It's a Fury Road. This Brody battle is kind of like a Fury Road. So the Germans are making their way, man, but they're making their way with explosion after explosion, and thousands of tanks are destroyed, okay? The Soviets even consider it, right? Zhukov thinks about making a double pincer, an encirclement around Dubno to surround the vanguards of the 1st Panzer Group. But that's just Zhukov's fantasy. He's not going to be able to do that. So there, the disaster is total. You even have some small actions that managed to achieve some success against the Germans. Like the 9th Mechanized Corps is commanded by a guy you know, Konstantin Rokossovsky. In fact, he's the link between the 2 battles we're comparing today, right? Brody and Kursk. Because here, in Brody, he commands the 9th Mechanized Corps. There, in Kursk, he's going to command a front, okay? He's going to command an army group center, right? Central Front, Soviet Central Front, okay? So Rokossovsky, he manages to get some tactical victories, like very limited ones, but he has no logistical support at all. And his attempt to hold that captured front line is quickly beaten back. Zhukov sends new orders for an immediate attack. Do you know what Rokossovsky does, man? Rokossovsky, a guy who had been compromised during the purges. He had been sent to the Gulag, and in 1940 was taken out of prison and reinstated. Then, in that situation, Rokossovsky says, "I'm not going to follow the orders. Man, Rokossovsky, just out of prison, should have wanted to follow all the orders, right? Afraid of going back? No. He said, I'm not going to follow the orders because that's irresponsible. He stays put. He doesn't follow the orders. In the end, the Germans push past the 3,500 tanks. That's a lot of tanks. 3,500 tanks, and they head towards Kiev, right? They head towards Kiev. So after that, there are several encirclement battles, right? There are several battles that will result in the capture of hundreds of thousands of Russian soldiers. This happens in the following 2 months, and it will result in the capture of Kiev in September. In fact, Mikhail Kirpanis will die during the operations that gave Kiev to the Germans, in the capture of Kiev by the Germans, right? Practical result of the Battle of Brody: 2,700 Russian tanks destroyed. 2,700. Did you imagine a number like that? 2,700 tanks destroyed. Do you know how many German tanks were destroyed?
85 destruídos.
And another 200 that had to be sent to Germany because they were so badly damaged. They went to Germany, to the workshops there in Germany, right? So during that period, in that window of time, you actually have the experience of Ewald von Kleist and also his subordinates, the tank commanders, battalion commanders, division commanders, against widespread confusion in the Red Army's ranks, which was going through a series of doctrinal changes right during this period. These doctrinal changes hadn't been completed yet. So that's a depiction of the biggest tank battle of all time, with the largest number of tanks in the same place, fighting against the same enemy, which was the 1st Panzer Group, right? All 6 of these mechanized corps fighting against the 1st Panzer Group. That's right. Did you already know this was the Battle of Brody? That the Battle of Brody was and really is the biggest clash, the greatest tank battle in history? Tell us here in the comments. If you like this video, then share it with your friends, but also, hey, give us a thumbs up. Don't forget to subscribe to Sala de Guerra so you don't miss anything else. I'll stop here for now. Thanks again for watching, and here's a big hug from Sala de Guerra.